I'm getting so tired. I'm getting so.
Y'all know what's going on. It's time for another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Bacon. Welcome to the show, y'all. I had a whole system worked out, and the system was airtight, and the system was alive. For 8 years, I'd been running it without ever naming it, the way you run your own heartbeat, automatic and unexamined. The system was this: nothing that happened to me was mine. The case that put me in here was the prosecutor's overreach, and a lawyer who didn't fight, and a jury that looked at me and saw what they'd already decided to see. The block I lived on was the warden's failure and the state's underfunding. My temper was my father's, passed down like a bad knee. My choices, when I let myself think of them as choices at all, were forced on me by where I came from, who raised me, what the streets offered a kid like me, which was nothing legal worth having. Everything pointed outward. Every arrow on my map ran away from me towards something or someone else to hold responsible, and I'd drawn that map so carefully and lived in it so long that I'd forgotten it was a map and not the territory. And here's the thing, nobody tells you the thing that made the system so hard to break. Most of it was true. That's what made it work. The prosecutor did overreach. My lawyer was overworked and underpaid and gave my life about as much attention as he gave the 40 other men whose files were stacked on his desk. And the system is rigged, genuinely, structurally, in ways I could lay out for you in detail and be right about every word. Where I grew up did fail me. The arrows on my map pointed at real things. That's why I could live inside it so comfortably for so long. A lie that's made entirely of true pieces is the hardest kind to ever see through, because every time you go to check one of the pieces, it holds. The pieces all hold. It's the shape they make together. That's the lie. You have to understand how total the system was inside my head, because that's what made it a system and not just a few complaints. It ran on everything. Bad food in the chow hall. The state didn't care about us, which was true. And so the disgust I felt scraping that tray became one more entry in the ledger of my grievances. One more thing done to me. A God who wrote me up for nothing. The power structure, the petty cruelty of men with a little authority, also true, also filed away as evidence that I was a victim of forces beyond me. A visit that fell through because the bus my mother takes broke down. Somehow even that, even my own mother's hardship, I metabolized into proof that the world was arranged against me. Everything that happened, good or bad, fed the machine, and the machine had one output, which was that Joe Baker was a man to whom things were done. I was a passive verb. For 8 years, I'd been a passive verb, and I'd mistaken the elaborateness of my grievance for the depth of my understanding. The day it cracked was nothing special. I want to say it was some dramatic moment, a confrontation, a revelation handed down. It wasn't. It was a Tuesday gray, the kind of day in here where the light through the high windows is the color of dishwater and the hours have no edges. I was in a program, one of those reentry classes the prison runs more for its own paperwork than for us, taught by a counselor named Priya Venkataraman, who'd been doing it long enough to have no illusions and short enough to still have some patience. And she wasn't even talking to me. She was talking to a younger guy across the circle, a kid, maybe 22. And he was running his own version of the system, the same map I had, his arrows all pointing outward, the streets, the cops, the judge, his uncle, who put a gun in his hand at 15. And he was right too. Every piece of his held. And I sat there listening to him, and I felt this strange vertigo because I was hearing my own argument come out of somebody else's mouth. And from the outside, from across the circle, I could hear what it actually was. It was the sound of a man explaining why he had no power. That's what I heard. Underneath all the true pieces, underneath the real prosecutor and the real streets and the real rigged system, the song the kid was singing was, none of this was up to me, None of it is up to me. None of it will ever be up to me. And I've been singing that same song for 8 years, and I thought I was singing about justice, about how the world had wronged me. But sitting across from that kid, I finally heard the other thing it was, which was a man volunteering for his own helplessness. Because if nothing is your fault, nothing is yours to change. The map that points all the arrows outward feels like an indictment of the world, but what it really is a permission slip to do nothing. And I'd been carrying that permission slip around like it was a wound when it was actually a hiding place. What got me most was the kid's hands while he talked. He had them open, palms up the whole time, like a man showing he's holding nothing, like a man proving he couldn't possibly be expected to do anything because look, my hands are empty. And I recognized the gesture because it was mine. I'd made that exact shape with my own hands in front of my own lawyer, in front of the parole board in my head every night, in front of my mother on the phone, empty hands. It's not on me, there's nothing here. I'm just the one it happened to. And watching a stranger make my gesture, I understood for the first time that empty hands aren't only a way of saying you're not guilty. They're also a way of saying you're not able. The same posture that protects you from blame strips you of any reach. You can't be held responsible, and you can't hold anything either. And the kid had been holding his hands open so long, he'd forgotten they were also the hands he'd need to climb out with. I didn't say anything in the circle. I'm not built to have my revelations out loud where men can watch them. But I carried that vertigo back to my cell, and it wouldn't leave me alone. Because once you've heard the song for what it is, you can't unhear it. And now every time I reach for the old comfort, the prosecutor, the lawyer, the streets, my father's temper, I could hear underneath it the kid's voice, my voice saying, none of this is up to me. And I knew it for what it was. A man making himself small and calling it being wronged. So I made myself do the hardest accounting of my life, and I did it alone over weeks on my bunk in the dishwater light. I took the errors one at a time. The prosecutor overreached, true, but I gave him the case. I did the thing. Not all of what they said I did. The charges were stacked the way they always are, but the core of it, the thing underneath the inflation, that was mine. I'd been pretending the overcharging meant the whole thing was injustice, using the part that was unfair to wave away the part that was true. The lawyer didn't fight, true, but I lied to that lawyer, held things back, played him the way I played everyone, and you can't expect a man to fight blind for you when you blindfolded him yourself. The streets offered me nothing legal, true, but there'd been men from my same block, my same nothing, who'd chosen different, and I'd looked down on them for it at the time, called them soft, and now they were free and raising children, and I was in here explaining how I'd had no choice. The choices had been there. I just hadn't liked them, so I told myself they didn't count as choices. The hardest arrow was my father, because that one I'd inherited honest, and it really did come down to me through no choice of my own. My temper, the thing in me that runs hot and fast and used to make decisions before the rest of me showed up, I came by that. The way you come by your eye color. My father had it, and his father before him by all accounts, and I'd spent my whole life pointing at that lineage as the explanation for the worst things I'd done, as though a man who hits or takes or destroys when the heat comes up is just a vehicle the family curse is driving. And the curse is real. I felt it in my own chest 1,000 times, that surge that wanted to make the world pay for whatever it had just done to me. But sitting with it in the gray light, I had to admit the thing I'd been ducking, which is that having the temper and obeying the temper are two different events with a gap between them. And the gap is where the man lives. My father never worked the gap. I told myself I couldn't either, that it was wired in, but I'd worked plenty of gaps in here when it suited me, when obeying the heat would have cost me too much. So I clearly knew the gap existed. I'd just been refusing to work it when working it was inconvenient and then blaming the wiring afterward. That one took me 3 nights to get all the way down to the bottom of, and the bottom of it was that I've been using my father as an alibi for a freedom I actually possessed and didn't want to be responsible for. I remembered a night, maybe a year before I caught my case, when I felt the heat come up over something small, and I'd held it, just held it, because the man across from me was somebody it would have cost me too much to swing on. I'd held the gap that night without even trying hard, and I'd never once let that memory near my story about the curse, because that memory was evidence the curse could be argued with, and I hadn't wanted the evidence. It went on like that, arrow by arrow, and it was the worst few weeks I'd spent in years. Worse than the early ones, because in the early ones I'd had the system to protect me, and now I'd taken my own protection away. There's a particular pain to dismantling the story that's been keeping you comfortable. You don't feel free at first. You feel exposed, skinned, like you've torn down the only walls you had left, which in a way I had. The system had been a kind of shelter. Blame is a roof. It keeps the hard rain of responsibility off you. And I'd just torn my roof off in the middle of a storm on purpose because I'd finally understood the roof was also a cage. I have to be careful here because there's a wrong way to take this lesson. And I took it wrong first, the way I take most things wrong first. For about a week, I overcorrected into something just as false as the blame had been. I swung all the arrows around to point at me, every single one. And I sat in this black pit of it's all my fault, which sounds like accountability, but is actually just blame with the target moved. And it's just as paralyzing. A man who believes everything is his fault is as stuck as a man who believes nothing is, because both of them have made the situation total and final. Both of them have removed the one thing accountability is actually supposed to give you, which is somewhere to go from here. Drowning in guilt is just another way of doing nothing while feeling like you're doing something heavy. It was Priya, again, not even talking to me again, who got me off that. She said something in the circle one day to the whole group that landed like it was meant for me. She said the point of looking at your part isn't to collect it like evidence against yourself. It's to find the part that's yours, because the part that's yours is the only part you can ever do anything about. The system is real, she said, and most of it you can't move an inch. Your part you can move. That's not a smaller truth. That's the only truth that comes with a door in it, that reframed everything. The blame map and the all my fault map had one thing in common. Neither had a door. Both were just rooms you sat in. The blame room was furnished nicer, more comfortable, but it was still a room with no door. What Priya was describing was the first thing I'd heard in 8 years that had a door in it. You find your part, not all the parts, not the prosecutor's part or the street's part or your father's part, just yours. And your part is the doorway, because your part is the only thing in the whole arrangement that answers to you. So I stopped doing the math to assign fault, mine or theirs, and started doing different math. The math of giving everything, all of it, the rigged system and my real choices both, what is actually mine to move from right here today on this bunk in this gray light? And that question, it turned out, had answers, where the blame question never had any. The blame question only ever produced more blame. This one produced things I could do. I could control how I spent my hours. I could control whether I learned anything. I could control whether I was a man my daughter would want to know, regardless of what the system did or didn't do for me, because that was mine. That was inside my wall. The system couldn't reach it unless I handed it over. I didn't tell anyone about the shift. There was no announcement, no testimony, none of the prison religion language that some men use to, mark a change like this and that. I've always distrusted because it points the arrows outward again, just at the sky this time. I just started living differently in small ways that nobody but me would notice at first. When something went wrong, and in here something always goes wrong, I'd feel the old reflex rise, the reflex to find the external thing to blame. And it's a strong reflex. It never fully went away, but I learned to let it rise and then ask the new question underneath it. Not whose fault is this? What's mine in this? What's the part with the door? I'll give you an example because the principle is easy and the living is hard. Months into all this, I got passed over for a job assignment I wanted, the kind of work that looks good on a record and makes the days move, and it went instead to a man with worse history than mine. And the old me would have known exactly what that was. Favoritism, the system, the same rigging that put me here, arrows out, case closed, another wound to add to the collection. And all of that might even have been true. But I made myself find my part. And my part was this. I'd never built a relationship with the officer who made those calls. Never given him a single reason to think of me as anything but a number, because building that relationship would have required me to be vulnerable, to want something visibly, and wanting things visibly had always felt like weakness to me. That was my part. The favoritism I couldn't move, my invisibility to the man making decisions that I could move. And I did slowly over the following months, not by sucking up, but by being consistent and present and known. The same lesson I keep relearning in this place in different costumes. I didn't get that particular job, but I got the next one. And I got it because I worked the part that was mine instead of just cataloging the parts that weren't. The deeper test came with Kezia, because that's where the old system had done its worst damage. And I hadn't even known it. For years, I'd had a story about why my daughter and I weren't close. And the story had all the usual arrows. Her mother had poisoned her against me. The system kept us apart. The distance, the visiting rules, the cost of the calls. The world had stolen my chance to be her father. All of it pointed out, and all of it again held up if you check the pieces. Her mother and I had history. The distance was real. The calls did cost more than they should. But when I made myself find my part, the part with the door, it was sitting right there, waiting, and it was uglier than any of the external pieces. My part was that I'd been a coward about her. I'd let the calls go unmade because hearing her be distant hurt. And I told myself the distance was her mother's doing, when really I've been protecting myself from a daughter who had every right to be wary of a father in a cage. I'd been doing to Kezia exactly what the kid across the circle did to his own life, narrating my powerlessness so I wouldn't have to do the frightening available thing, which was simply to reach for her consistently and risk her not reaching back. The system kept us apart by maybe 20%. The other 80 was me, hiding behind the 20. Once I saw that, I started calling more, writing more, showing up in the only ways the bars allow, not because it was guaranteed to work, but because it was the part that was mine. The first few calls were terrible. She was guarded, gave me one-word answers, and the old reflex screamed that this was proof her mother had turned her, proof I should give up, proof it wasn't on me. And I had to sit through those one-word answers and keep calling anyway, because giving up would have just been the empty hands again, the open palms. Look, there's nothing I can do. There was something I could do. I could call again next week and the week after and not let her silence be the verdict I'd been waiting for permission to accept. So I did, and slowly, over months, I couldn't see the end of the one-word answers, got 2 words, then 3, and I learned that the door doesn't swing open. It scrapes an inch at a time, and only for the man who keeps a hand on it. That's the whole shape of the thing. Every place in my life where I'd had a clean story about being wronged, there was a smaller, harder true story underneath it about a door I'd refused to walk through. And the wrong story had been built precisely to keep me from having to see the door. Here's what I want to be honest about, the thing that keeps this from being a tidy story. Stopping the blame didn't make the system fair. That's the part that the people who love this kind of lesson always want to skip past. I see it clearer now than I ever did when I was busy blaming it. I see exactly how rigged it is, how stacked, how indifferent, because you can only really see a thing once you stop using it as a shield. Letting go of blame didn't mean deciding the system was just. It's not. It meant deciding that the system's injustice wasn't going to be the thing I organized my one life around. Because organizing my life around it had only ever made me smaller, had only ever fed me the comfortable poison of helplessness. The system is still my enemy. I just stopped letting it be my excuse, and those are two completely different things. And it took me 8 years and a kid across the circle to learn the difference. The day I stopped blaming everyone else didn't fix anything. I want to say that as plainly as I can, because the false version of this story is that the realization changed my circumstances, and it didn't. I was still in prison, still am. The walls didn't move an inch. My sentence didn't shorten. The guards were still guards. The food was still the food. The rigging was still the rigging. What changed wasn't around me. It was the place I was standing inside of it. I'd spent 8 years as a man things happened to, a man with a thorough and accurate list of everyone who'd done him wrong, and that man was powerless by definition because the whole identity was built on power being elsewhere. The man I started becoming on that gray Tuesday was somebody smaller in his claims and bigger in his reach, somebody who'd given up the satisfying story of total innocence in exchange for the unsatisfying useful truth that some small but real fraction of his life had a door in it, and that the door, however small, was his. I think about that kid across the circle sometimes. I never said anything to him, never told him he handed me my own life by accident. He probably moved on, transferred or paroled or just drifted to another part of the yard, still singing the song, the one that's made of all true pieces and adds up to a lie. I hope he hears it someday the way I did. But I've learned you can't hand someone that hearing. They have to catch it sideways when they're not braced for it the way I did. All I can do is to work on my own part, the part with the door, every day in the dishwater light, knowing the system won't thank me for it and won't change because of it, and was never going to. The door was never going to lead out of the building. It was only ever going to lead out of the smaller cage I'd built inside the big one. But that smaller cage was the only one I had the key to, and I spent 8 years insisting I didn't even hold the key, when the whole time it had been in my own hand. People hear a story like this, and they want it to mean I forgive the system, or that I think I belong here, or that I've made peace with the punishment. None of that. I don't forgive the rigging, and I won't pretend the sentence fits the man I am now, or even the man I was then. But forgiveness and accountability turned out to be different rooms entirely, and I've been confusing them my whole life, thinking that to hold myself responsible for my part was the same as letting everyone else off the hook for theirs. It isn't. I can know the system wronged me and know I wronged myself, both true, both at once, the way the kids' pieces were all true and mine were all true. The difference is I stopped letting the first truth swallow the second, because only the second one ever came with a door, and a man with no door is just a man waiting to die in a comfortable story about whose fault it is that he never lived. This has been another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and I say peace, y'all.